Billions to Trillions to Action, Mobilizing Finance for Development 2016 to 2030. The Role of Private Philanthropy in Development with Jeffrey Lang.
So the Gates Foundation, if we were to describe what we do, we have two big pieces to our work. We put out in total about $5 billion of so-called charitable expenditure every year. And about 3/4 of that goes to global development and public health purposes. I think what's been happening in maybe the last 15 or 20 years is that with the enormous growth of private wealth in the world, in advanced countries, but also in some developing or emerging countries, there has been a huge addition of capital to private philanthropy, and there have been some big initiatives to set up foundations or set up private wealth for philanthropic purposes. What private foundations are looking for often, and certainly in the case of the Gates Foundation, is they're looking for where there could be an edge, where relatively small but maybe more risk-tolerant resources can really make a difference to the total effort. You know, if the UK or the World Bank or the US are putting, a couple of $1 billion of aid into some country or into some program, the fact that even a large foundation like the Gates Foundation might add 100 million or 200 million is important. It's an act of solidarity. It's an act of partnership. But for us, it's less the 100 million or 200 million or whatever it is, and more, what can we do that will help to change the game? Can we take some risks about a technology? Can we bet on some rather new approach to a well-known problem that might unlock new solutions or unlock something different? Because we don't have, skeptical parliamentarians that we're answering to. We don't have shareholders who are looking at the bottom line. We have benefactors who are saying, we want you to take responsible, well-informed, data-driven risks, but we want you to take risks because we need better solutions than the ones we've got. I think philanthropy will make an important contribution, but measuring it just in terms of the number of dollars is probably mistaken. If I think 15 years ago to the beginnings of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, which was kickstarted really by a substantial investment from the Gates Foundation and from others, including the UK and the United States and so on, but it was pushed by a philanthropic initiative. 15 years ago, major pharmaceutical companies were exiting the vaccine field. It was a mature market in rich countries. There was perceived to be no money to pay for new vaccines in poor countries. And so the big pharma companies answerable to their shareholders were saying, this is not a growth business, we need to look elsewhere. I think that was an example of having a good business model to spread benefits of new vaccines, even to very poor countries, much more quickly than had happened in the past. A scaled up effort of money, including bringing other donors and contributors together in that common initiative. And the third thing was really strong advocacy for the cause of vaccines, for their life-saving capability and for their importance in public health in very poor or resource-poor settings. And with those three things coming together, I think we have demonstrated to the private sector that this is a market that they need to pay attention to. Not only established pharma companies, but new entrants, for example, from India and soon, I think, from China and other countries, entering that market and saying, we can supply very poor countries and very poor people with a certain amount of declining public subsidy from entities like Gavi, and we can do it efficiently and at scale. And I think that's a great example of the private sector being energized and shown an opportunity by a philanthropic plus aid initiative working in a smart way. Like most foundations, the Gates Foundation mostly uses grants as its financial instrument of choice. So we give grants. We give grants to non-government intermediaries. We sometimes give grants to government entities, but that's not so common. And those are against very specific milestones or mutual expectations of what the grant is supposed to achieve. So that's the dominant way we do it. But partly, going back to the issue of energizing private sector involvement, we have also done things like take equity shares in what are essentially private companies. We've made private investments, in other words. The difference for us is we do not get any profit from them. We plow anything that is made in the form of a loan or an equity participation. Any income that comes from that gets plowed back so that we are strictly, in terms of the law, charitable in our purposes. We don't make income from it. So we've done things like that. Occasionally we've done other things, and this would be familiar to people who know about the World Bank or development banking and similar things. We have given guarantees where there's a reasonable certainty that something good is going to be done, but there is maybe a financial gap or a timing gap in getting the resources together to get that done. We've also had some experiments where we have worked with, in some cases, government donors where government donors are in a position to make loans, actually including the World Bank's IDA for that matter, are able to make loans for an activity which we think, and maybe the countries think, ought to be a grant. An example of that is the eradication of polio, where the good to the world of a given country eradicating polio is very large, even though there may only be a small amount of polio in that country. So in that case, we think there's a public goods externality argument for the economists among you to say we will buy down the cost of that loan so that it's the equivalent of a grant if the country or the entity that is the borrower performs what it's supposed to do in order to get that job done. So that's an example of a slightly more creative way of using our funds rather than a straightforward grant. We try to think of fitting the financial instruments we use to the purposes that we're trying to accomplish and to the partners that we're working with, because they might need different things. I do think philanthropy can play a role, again, to go back to my point about risk appetite, in looking for solutions, taking chances about what would work, not taking chances at other people's expense, but taking technological and scientific risks to find the solutions that the world is going to need in the next 20, 30, 50 years.